Okay, today we are talking about antiquities and how they relate in our world today, what people are doing with them, and how we can take care of them, and what is concerning. So, to figure this out. So, what is meant by cultural heritage? So, cultural heritage can be tangible, like paintings, sculptures, coins, manuscripts, things that are movable, or immovable cultural heritage, like monuments, archeological sites. Underwater cultural heritage, so shipwrecks, underwater ruins and cities. And intangible, like oral traditions, performing arts, rituals, dances. And then there's natural heritage, like natural sites that have cultural aspects to them. And another term to think of in this dialogue is cultural property, which is the physical constituents of the cultural heritage of a group of or society. So according to UNESCO, that's the United Nations cultural wing, cultural property is the possessions which on religious or secular grounds is important for archaeology, prehistory, history, literature, art, or science. According to Hague Convention, which was started to protect culture after World War II. Now, cultural patrimony is the ownership of cultural heritage, the ownership of objects possessing continuing cultural, traditional, or historical importance to the specific heritage of a group, like especially those considered inalienable as the group, as the time of the objects had been separated from them, from historical settings of objects. So often things that were taken early from Native American graves and put in museums that the natives have then sought to get back, because and what they would use in the cases was that it was their cultural patrimony, their cultural heritage, their cultural patrimony, their cultural property. So there's two holders and buyers of this. There's, we would say, up at the top, you look at the Metropolitan Museum of New York. This is sort of the United States, Britain, Germany. They're the culture buying countries where many objects from culture-rich countries reside in the museums or in private collectors' homes. Now, culture-rich countries are the countries whose industry mainly relies on culture, or tourism, and have very little industry, but several important historical, archaeological, and cultural sites and heritage. So Mayan heritage, or you could even talk about, like in Cambodia, the Angkor Wat, and like the dancing, the Gupta dancing, etc. So when we when we use cultural patrimony to try to get our cultural heritage back from somewhere where it's been taken, first of all, we look at provenance of an object when it's been, say, gone through an auction house. That a provenance is the history of where an object came, who owned it, and then who made it, who owned it, who bought it, where it's been held. So it's documentation. In repatriation is the retiring of a work to a original owner. So again, like the NAGPRA, Native Graves Repatriation Acts, where bones and objects in American museums have been systematically repatriated to tribes, if the tribes still had a connection to those objects. But in antiquities, like really ancient, if we're going to honor a cultural connection, whose connection are we going to honor? For example, in Honduras, the native peoples that live there now um, do not have a connection, ethnically to the indigenous who lived there at the time of the Spanish invaders, because the indigenous that lived there then got up and fought them really hard and were decimated. But archaeologists are trying to get them interested in the archaeology as their own kind of heritage, simply, to take care and not let looters in to the sites. But, what if someone else knows a lot about it? Can they have connection to it? Or, if it's been taken by a country, say it was a rug that was in Peru, but then moved to bought, and is hanging in New York and treated really well. And Peru says, "Hey, we need that. That's our patrimony." But then you look back at how it's being cared for in Peru, and the different rugs of the same type aren't being cared for. So it's like, who do you honor? It's complicated. Now, archaeology is the scientific study of historic or prehistoric peoples and their cultures by detailed analysis of their artifacts, inscriptions, monuments, and other such remains, especially those that have been excavated. Now, archaeology, a couple hundred years ago, basically started out with a lot of Germans and English looting, but it became a very scientific discipline where you figure out where something is in the house and you find a jar in that house. And you can tell, well, this was in a woman's area, and so the jar is related to their work, or etc. You learn a lot about an object by figuring out its archaeological context. So archaeologists used to just be collectors, and now they're less interested in the object and more interested in knowing about the past and asking all sorts of questions about a piece, systematically removing it. So I've got a Dr. Pepper here. And so someone finds this in my house, and they're looking at it, and then they can do some research about it, like what's inside it. Like they do, what ingredients are in there, and they figured out it's some kind of sweet drink, caffeinated drink. And then they can make assumptions about, well, they can look at the decoration. Oh, it looks like some kind of football symbol, maybe it has relationship to the football season. But they can make assumptions also by seeing that it's sitting on my desk next to next to a computer, that it's aiding me in work. It has some properties, and that it is not, this is not also in a fancy cup. So this is not something used for the most fancy occasions. And, so you get all this information, and also that there's multiples that they might find of these. Okay, so these are mass produced, and, when, and etc. You can know, oh, it's a female was drinking it. She was using it as she was working. Okay, it aids in work somehow. This is what it was made of. So where you might find that this came from a factory far away, and so trade is involved. Also the logo, it says, what are important to the people that might be drinking it, and the values, etc. So you can learn so much, and just, oh, it's sitting in this room, it's not sitting in the dining room, it's not being served this way. So there's all sorts of things that you can learn just by where it is and doing the research about it. Okay, and that's very systematic, that knowledge. You have to be very systematic about how you do it. So values of archaeologists versus art buyers, it's really who owns the past. Dealers, collectors care about this. Now, this is really secondary. They aren't interested in amassing things archaeologists are secondary to archaeologists. Now, who controls the past is another question. Now, archaeologists are very interested in this. Most of them don't own antiquities. They are interested in context and chronologies, how objects are found, what they are, let's know about them. And the next thing is looting. So illegal excavation and removal of objects to plunder or take illegally or take in war. It deprives knowledge, culture, context, documentation, provenance, etc. And so looting kind of destroys all that information that we've learned about class, society, work, even value, and also trade, how they got the ingredients, how they got what they made to make this aluminum piece. So the importance of maintaining an archaeology site is a very important slide, is what you learn from archaeology. Each artifact comes with where it was found, letting us know about gender roles, if found in women's rooms, or if it's, a person of high stature, etc. Food, if it contained elements of organic matter like beer yeast, etc. Or trade, where they got the ingredients from, ritual, religion. And if looted, we lose all that information and are forced to look at the object as art and only art. You've noticed that when you see like next to nothing written. So we see it not as a piece of culture that lived thousands of years ago that we're interacting with. We can only look at formally, which is, visual literacy. We're like, oh, is it round? Is it, maroon? Is it, how does it, what's its weight? And that's my problem with ancient art museums, is often because so much of their objects are looted, we don't learn from them. They're just reduced to look at art. And a lot of ancient objects were not made as art. They were made as something functional or ritual. They had a whole context to be seen. And it's not fair to just see them as decoration. So think of all that would be missed if we're just looking at this as like, look, it's maroon with white stripes, isn't it pretty, in 100 years. So past archaeology, as we know, was more like looting. Archaeologists sought to recover fabulous objects and remove them and bring them to their own institutions. And this is totally different nowadays. We no longer seek to wrest treasures from the ground to bring to museums far away. Instead, archaeologists' main emphasis is learning more about the people and the culture who created the objects. With this objective, we learn more and objects stay in the countries where they were found. So reasons for looting, they're mementos. Some people, like even soldiers, like just take things. Colonialism, people would come in and just sort of take things back to, Spain, or, if it's the French in Vietnam, all over the world, the colonists, Africa, they would take mementos or things back to the home country and loot. Poverty can lead people to sell their own cultural property and tomb raid in their own countries. And this has been going on for thousands and thousands of years, sometimes just sacking monuments and stealing from people that you have conquered as a way to take away their power. Also, there's a lack of connection people have to their local history. And so if they can get 20 bucks for something, or 50, they will sell it to an intermediary. And of course, that intermediary goes and sells it for 20 times as much or 30 times as much to someone else in Switzerland, etc. War is a big time of looting for thousands of years. Just look at the Arch of Titus, when what we will see when uh, it's shown that Titus takes the big menorah, grand menorah of the big temple in Jerusalem, and takes it back to Rome. So specific commission from a collector or buyer. Now there's a lot of that too, where a collector will commission a looter to like go get something that they know exists. But we know looting deprives us of the knowledge of culture, of context, of documentation, of provenance, which are also important for the validity of dealers and connoisseurs. And looting obliterates the record of ancient civilizations, especially in poor countries such as the Americas and Southeast Asia. So there's the sales, you need the provenance, and they make it up, but there's a whole illicit economy, even in what we think of as legitimate. I worked in an auction house, and there were many provenance documents that were questionable, and they would always start in Switzerland or end in Switzerland, and that's the big place where they have less regulations. So we would only go back 50 years to Switzerland, and then you wouldn't know where else they came from. There's just some dealer. So auction houses are a part of the problem. They've been called to task, but they have been a part of the problem. And then of course there's black market. And when you cut down, the black market, when you really apply a lot of rules, then the black market thrives. And these are wealthy people on the black market, and you don't see these objects ever. They're just in their fancy homes in Manhattan or Japan or wherever. But there's a big black market, but also, as we will find, the Taliban, Al Qaeda, all, in the Congo, Africa, all use the black art market to fund their activities. So the people that are plundering are tombleros, which are like bootleg excavators, tomb raiders, the official name for tomb raiders. The middlemen are traffic in looted materials with these people. The dealers, it might be 4 or 5 dealers. They meet often in Switzerland, and the prices increase with the exchange of hands. And German, US, British, Japanese dealers, maybe now Chinese, they might be a collector back home. There are good dealers out there. These are 2 dealers that are questionable. The sale of antiquities, however, is a business in violation of the law, and all collectors know that much of ancient art is stolen, and there are dealers who often make fines and contribute to understanding the past, such as in Xochipala, Mexico, where their connoisseurship led them to finding the earliest Olmec civilization. They can be known for a scholarship, but many, let's just be honest, are known for chickenry and backstabbing. Especially a Basel dog case was famous for like forgery that was linked to ancient Greece. And then it turned out it was like as these people bought it, it was a cheap copy, even though it was, even made it to made it to a museum in Basel. So, there's all sorts of issues. So the other players are the museums, and there are some good ones that more archeologically oriented museums that really insist on documentation. And recently that's the Field Museum of Chicago, German museums, and recently the British Museum, which it wasn't always. Now the object museums that are still having issues, the Brooklyn, no, not the Brooklyn, they're pretty good. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts, sometimes the Brooklyn has issues. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, they're more like formal driven, classical, connoisseur type museums. And so there's still a ways to go, but mounting pressure over the last 20 years is changing things. And one of the big things is the UNESCO Act, which was UNESCO is the part of United Nations that protects, promotes, transmits, preserves culture and heritage. For all sorts of things in for development and development of culture and creative industries. But they made an act that basically made it quasi-criminal to do these things, and so it's become more serious. But even more serious is the U.S. made a very criminal act called the Stolen Properties Act, and dealers are afraid of that. They'd rather go through UNESCO if they get caught doing something. So, what are the implications? Let's really of the cultural property trade and looting for how we look at classical objects, and the objects that we're going to look at in this class is that the effort to look at objects, we want to look at them not only for their artistic innovations and beauty, but also what they have to tell us about history. And it's looting, it takes the latter part away from us, and all we can look at is how they look at. And if there is any hope of saving the imperiled past, it may be requiring not only new laws, but entirely new attitude. Okay, so on to this, and we'll think about this as we go through the course.